Hey guys, Cloud Connection here, and before the video begins, I just wanted to let you know that I am letting you guys decide what my first retrospective of 2022 will be. It's a three-way battle between Sonic Adventure, Jet Set Radio, and Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards. You can find the link to the poll where you can vote in the description or in the comments below, and please do not comment your choice on this video, they will not count. And just a quick note, all three of these games will be getting retrospectives at some point. This poll is just to determine which one gets the spotlight in January. Now with that said, on to the video. Paper Mario is notorious among fans for losing sight of its original vision after the Thousand-Year Door, and Sticker Star was the turning point in creating the franchise's new, simpler direction. From that game forward, the series ceased to be an RPG franchise and went for a platformer mixed with turn-based puzzle battles and a papercraft art style that influences its main gameplay mechanic. It is certainly a controversial legacy, but one that ultimately has defined the back half of Paper Mario's library. That's true for the fifth game in the series as well, which continued in a lot of Sticker Star's footsteps and kept its feet away from the series' roots. This game followed so closely behind its predecessor that those who liked what Sticker Star did were intrigued, yet it also did little to convince those who were displeased with the last title. But at the very least, it would be a very colorful game. This is Paper Mario Color Splash. Regardless of Sticker Star's reputation in the fandom, its commercial success ensured that the series would continue, this time with a mechanic centered around painting. This gameplay element was suggested by director of production Atsushi Ikuno, who was inspired by watching his kids having fun coloring. With the shift to the Wii U, the team at Intelligent Systems finally had the power to create graphics that accurately depicted its characters and worlds as being made out of paper. To that end, the artist researched various types of paper textures to help transform the visuals into something truly worthy of the game's name. Once again, the designers focused on puzzle solving and platforming rather than in-depth combat, introducing a card-based system that focused on the use of the console's gamepad. The lack of differentiation in the NPCs also remained, meaning that once again, the world would be populated with toads and almost nothing else. All of Nintendo's press coverage indicated that the game would pull a lot from Sticker Star, which did not sit well with those who hated that game. In fact, within half an hour of the trailer for Color Splash dropping, a petition on Change.org calling for the game's cancellation was started. I already talked about the divide in fan opinion in the last video and won't cover it further, but I wanted to mention that specifically as an indication of how far fans are willing to go to protect their image of the series. Paper Mario Color Splash was released on October 7, 2016, and despite receiving generally positive reviews from critics, it became the worst-selling game in the Paper Mario franchise, only pushing 870,000 units. The fact that it launched very late into the Wii U's lifespan is likely the major reason why it sold so poorly, especially considering the console itself was steadily losing its remaining legs. By the time the game came out, a release date for the Nintendo Switch, then known as the NX, was already known, and just 2 weeks later, the console would be officially announced. Whatever momentum Color Splash could have had effectively died because of that, but were those low sales numbers indicative of the game's quality as well? Let's find out. Color Splash begins with Princess Peach visiting Mario on a dark and stormy night to deliver a letter she received, though this letter is actually a folded up paper toad drained of all its color. This letter came from Prisma Island, and so they set off to investigate, but find the town of Port Prisma deserted. They soon discover a sentient paint can named Huey, who informs them of the big paint stars, objects that provide Prisma Island with all of its colors, but which have gone missing. It's later revealed that Bowser attempted to grab the big paint stars to turn his shell rainbow-colored, but by mixing the paints together, the paint turned black and corrupted Bowser into the being known as Black Bowser. Black Bowser and the Koopalings from Super Mario Bros. 3 threaten to coat the entire island in black paint, so Huey teams up with Mario to find the big paint stars and help restore the color back to Prisma Island. By now, the basic overworld gameplay of Paper Mario has already been well established, and Color Splash is not any different. You're still Mario, moving around, jumping, hitting things with your hammer and the like, but with less of a focus on platforming this time. Instead, the emphasis in each level is back on solving puzzles and challenges, usually by using Mario's new Paint Hammer ability, which lets him spread splotches of paint around to color the world. Mario has 6 colors at his disposal, and thanks to the context-sensitive nature of the hammer, you'll deploy the color needed for a particular spot just by striking it, simplifying this mechanic significantly. I like the paint hammer as a tool for interacting with the environment, but I'll admit it can be pretty tedious to use at times, especially when you need to hit things at a precise angle or position to color in everything. This is especially true of larger objects since you're spending a lot of time making sure you get enough nooks and crannies to satisfy the puzzle. Beyond this, the only other gameplay mechanic to talk about for the overworld stuff is Cutout, a take on paperization from the last game. When you reach certain areas of a map, you can cut out a part of the scenery to either place a battle card into the spot, access hidden areas, or even traverse across otherwise inaccessible terrain. I didn't care for paperization in Sticker Star, but I find the cutout mechanic is better implemented as you can only enter this mode when you're near a place where it's required, cutting out a majority of the guesswork. It's still an arbitrarily tacked on element though, and I wish there were more uses for this as well as the paint mechanic beyond just whacking everywhere with your hammer. But paint isn't just used for coloring the world, as it's also an essential part of the battle system, which in this game revolves around battle cards that deliver single-use attacks or status conditions. In practice, they're not that different from stickers, and since many of the attacks are lifted from that game, it's safe to say that if you didn't enjoy Sticker Star's combat, you're not going to like Color Splashes. All the changes and additions come in the more granular details, most of which revolve around using the Wii U gamepad because, of course they do. Once you've chosen the cars you want, you can fill them with paint to boost their potency and then flick them up to use them. You can also pick the returning battle spinner to place a card into your inventory, letting you save valuable cards for when they're needed. It all feels very gimmicky, especially since the card menu is located on the gamepad. If you're just looking at the TV, you only see everyone standing there, with enemies occasionally giving you hints or sassy remarks. Instead of health bars, you judge how much life an enemy has left by seeing how much color they have, as each attack drains a bit from their sprite, a cool effect that ties into the game's theme, which, as I've said, I love seeing. Things also return, and once again, they're very powerful against bosses, but you need to be careful not to waste them before you need them. Thankfully, there's a Toad in Port Prisma who will give you hints as to which things you need and whether or not you have them already, which at least means you can gather what you're missing ahead of time. Once again, the battles themselves aren't very fulfilling because they barely give you any meaningful reward that isn't self-serving for the combat. You occasionally get battle cards for defeating enemies, and all foes drop paint and or coins that you can use to refill your paint supply and buy more battle cards with respectively. As I said last time, without a purpose for fighting enemies beyond clearing out a required encounter, the battle system grows tiring very quickly. You're not fighting because you want to become stronger and fight better, you're fighting so you can have more battles later down the road. But I'll give the developers some credit, as enemies sometimes drop hammer scraps, which, when you collect enough, upgrades the total amount of paint you can carry at once. So there is an incentive to fight these guys because having more paint keeps you prepared for filling in battle cards and colorless spots, which should make this a better designed combat system overall. I say it should, but just like Sticker Star, there's a lot of little details and mechanics that bring it down, even more so than the last game. Running away is still, from what I can gather, random, but this time there's even less indication of whether or not it will work, with no animation or graphical change until Mario begins tripping. This is such a small thing and might seem inconsequential, but it's so weird seeing this valuable feedback stripped away. Another element I don't like is Kamek, who will randomly show up at the beginning of a battle, make it so that you can't flee, and apply a limitation on your battle cards, such as hiding which attacks they are or changing them all to the same card. This happened in Sticker Star too, but only at predetermined spots, whereas here, you seemingly always run into the risk of having to perform each battle with an unknown handicap, which absolutely sucks. And sorting cards remains a hassle, as you collect so many that you need to organize them in some way, either through the auto sort or by manually picking and moving cards. But manually sorting battle cards is such a slog because of how few cards you have on screen at once, which also makes it annoying to move back and forth between your collection when you're looking for a certain card. Even if fundamentally the battles are mostly the same as in Sticker Star, I find this battle system a little worse overall because while fights certainly have more of a purpose, the finer elements bring it down significantly. Once again, I found myself avoiding fights at certain parts, though not as aggressively as in Sticker Star. I definitely see how fights are beneficial to your progress, but with how unfun they are, it's just not very engaging. Color Splash retains the multiple individual levels approach that Sticker Star championed, although unlike that game, progression isn't explicitly marked in the level titles. Your goal is to collect the mini paint stars located in a stage, and each one unlocks the pathway to a different level. Usually this is how you open up the next world you need to visit, but some areas contain multiple mini paint stars that open up different routes, some even creating shortcuts on the world map. Despite the big paint stars each being color-coded, you can collect multiple colors of mini paint stars on the way to those bigger objectives. Sticker Star did this too, as some levels did have multiple exits, but because of how the course end objective is a star with a specific color, it's easy to get confused in figuring out what exactly you're working towards. It's something you get used to while you play, yet it's also an oddly constructed manner of laying out the game structure that it makes you question what your end goals really are. There's nothing stopping you from just leaving the mini paint stars you don't need to collect at the moment behind, but without seeing where that objective leads to, you won't know whether or not it's necessary to grab it until you explore the level it unlocks. That's partially because Color Splash occasionally likes to hide required items or NPCs in levels that you're not explicitly told to go to, forcing you to wander around to see what you might have missed. The game isn't as backtracky as the first two games, but it still forces you to double back to previously explored levels often enough to be noticeable. You can technically say there are 6 chapters here, divided by the big paint star you're currently hunting, plus the final level in Black Bowser's castle. The game treats the collection of a big paint star after beating a Koopaling as the capstone to a portion of the game, effectively acting as chapter dividers without directly telling you so. For the purposes of this video, I'll be referring to each quest for a paint star as a chapter, as most do tell a condensed narrative like the previous games. Chapter 1 begins, as you'd expect, with a couple of grassland levels, but there's also an underground section that reminds me a lot of the new Super Mario Bros. Cave aesthetic, as well as a beachside resort and a stone tower. This chapter is a decent start, but it goes on for far too long. You're moving back and forth between a lot of the map, and you don't even get the red big paint star until about 4 hours in. It didn't set the best first impression for me, though thankfully it only got better from there. The second chapter sees you travel across a cliff and through a forest where everything is giant to eventually encounter a dig site that's beleaguered by earthquakes, and finally a coliseum where you need to fight for the yellow paint star, and this chapter I really liked. While it doesn't really have an overarching theme besides the archaeological dig, each level is memorable in its own right, from your first encounter with the black paint to the giant chain chomp named Princess. It does start off pretty slow, but it ramps up quickly once you reach the dig site, ending in a pretty epic climax in the arena with this showdown against 100 enemies especially catching me off guard, in a good way. The blue paint star is held in a fortress where Shy Guys train themselves, but to get there, you need to help a haunted hotel bring everything back to order, travel through a forest where everything is the opposite of giant, and then experience another round of Sniff It or Whiff It. Chapter 3 has a lot of content and it all works well enough, but I can't help but feel like the levels could have been tied together with stronger ideas. Like even in Sticker Star, not every stage in a world had the same exact theme or layout, but they were all subservient to an overarching concept that informed the aesthetic of each section. There's no real connection between the hotel, woods, and fortress here, and I consider that a missed opportunity. Chapter 4 is unique as it consists of one whole narrative journey throughout as you join a bunch of sailors on your way to Fortune Island, rumored not just to have riches beyond belief, but also the purple paint star. It's the first of these post-TTYD chapters to really remind me of the classic games on the level design front, as the end goal is clearly defined at the start and because it's more about the journey itself. While it isn't my favorite part of Color Splash, it at least ties all its narrative threads together in a tighter package, throwing in a unique element with the parallel world. The 5th chapter might just be my favorite for its concepts alone, as it combines both the final journey of a rundown train and a bunch of passenger toads who are just trying to get to a restaurant and eat something. Using the train as a common anchor point between these sections is brilliant, as just like the ship of the previous chapter, each stop feels like the natural progression of a smaller story rather than just another level. It's also a strangely relaxing chapter because sometimes the quest for the orange paint star almost feels like a secondary goal. Some of the most reflective moments in the game happen here, and honestly, it gave me a lot of Thousand Year Door vibes. That's not to say it doesn't have its frustrating moments. That battle with the stake, while a fun idea, is incredibly annoying if you keep messing up and have to start paying mountains of coins to try again, but when this chapter gets it right, it gets it right. Last up is the green paint star in chapter 6, held in a circus put on by Shy Guys that makes for an awesome setting that I wish was given its own section rather than just one level. Instead, we have to travel through a volcano, which is fun but not very interesting, a Super Paper Mario inspired trip through SMB3 that is an enjoyable nostalgia trip, and a foggy woods area that is pretty boring. The circus is an amazing finale and is one of my favorite parts of the game for sure, but just like the third chapter, everything leading up to it just doesn't give it the proper build-up. Color Splash has a weird thing where some of its sections will run with one or two concepts and provide a miniature adventure like the first two games, while others go all over the place like a Super Paper Mario world. On the whole, the game's worlds are all generally of good quality, but because of the inconsistencies in how they're set up, it's easy to pinpoint where a chapter falls short compared to the others. Once you've got the big paint stars, it's time to head to Black Bowser's castle in the sky, courtesy of Luigi and his cart traveling up Rainbow Road, something I swear they did just to add a Luigi death stare joke. Anyway, in addition to holding the final Koopaling, the only real gameplay segments are blowing up the paint factory and the final showdown with the man himself. Another main character uses their ultimate ability to finally take down the big bad confrontation, just like in Sticker Star. And if you couldn't tell, that's somewhat of a frequent occurrence in this game, segments that feel identical to those in Sticker Star, not direct callbacks, but more like the same idea used as a springboard for a different execution. This is especially noticeable to me since I played Sticker Star just a couple of weeks ago, and while I find Color Splash does these elements better overall, it's clear that Intelligent Systems was reaching into a lot of the same buckets, almost as if this is Sticker Star HD. The new spins are different enough and better enough to keep this from being a problem, and while I'm not a fan of that design process, I at least acknowledge that the developers made it work. But where I think Color Splash absolutely trumps Sticker Star is in the visuals, because this is a phenomenal looking Paper Mario game. The jump from the 3DS to the Wii U is absolutely stunning, and perhaps it's not fair to judge this in comparison to a handheld system, but it's not just the fact that the world is in HD that makes it stand out. Environments absolutely pop in this game, thanks to the rich colors and detailed backgrounds providing a lovely visual counterpart to the level constructions to a degree I haven't seen since Thousand Year Door. It's continuing a lot of trends established in the first Paper Mario game, like the arts and crafts theme and clever visual references to the 2D nature of its characters, but it takes all of those elements to the next level. Character models have paper edges around them now, helping the inhabitants stand out against the backdrops and further emphasizing the paper aspect of the Paper Mario world. Just like in Sticker Star, the characters will sometimes be folded or crumpled up to indicate that they've been hurt, which when combined with the sapping of colors from many characters, really sells you on the concept of a world made out of paper. The fact that these people are made of paper actually feels real this time around, and not just a gimmick to differentiate itself in the art department. And again, the vibrant color palette and handmade looking architecture help to create a fantastically charming and appealing visual style. Dare I say it, the best graphics in a Paper Mario game so far. Of course, Origami King might beat it when I get to that, but for now, I really appreciate the level of detail in making this world come alive. Just on a conceptual level, I really dig the paint theme and how it's represented through the graphics, flying all over the place where you swing your paint hammer and getting splotches of paint everywhere. It's kind of a controlled way to spread chaos into the environment, since cutscenes and interactions happen in real time, letting you add a bit of a personal touch to the game's artwork. It reminds me a lot of finger painting as a kid, where you aren't necessarily thinking about making something neat, clean, or even representative of the subject you're trying to create. Half the fun is just placing paint down. It's not a great gameplay mechanic, and yet it appeals to me way more than the stickers on a basic level, and that has to count for something. The soundtrack was created by Fire Emblem Fates composer Takeru Kanazaki, Yakuza series audio designer Shigemitsu Goto, and Origami King composer Fumihiro Isobe, and they do some solid work here. Stylistically, it's a simpler soundtrack, bringing back a full orchestra while also mixing in some synths and other instruments where appropriate. It's still flexible in terms of genre, matching the tone of each area and how the melodies and beats fit together, but it never feels quite as eccentric as the music of the previous games. Unfortunately, the music often got lost in the mix for me. There were very few standout tracks that caught my attention when I played, and most just felt like background noise. But the songs at least make a very pleasant companion to the action on screen, and never step over it, which I can absolutely compliment it for. The battle theme is, to me, pretty middle of the road. It's not a particularly catchy tune, but it does at least match the mood of the encounters. Perhaps I need more time with this soundtrack to really appreciate it, but especially coming off the heels of Sticker Star, which has a fantastic score, Color Splash's music seems more adequate than anything else. But the soul of this game is in the writing, as once again, the designers placed a lot of emphasis on witty dialogue and the stories of individual levels rather than on an overarching narrative. I'll commend Color Splash for tightening up some of Sticker Star's narrative faults, specifically in its main characters. The whole "you're only talking to toads for most of the game" trope still applies, and that aspect's still not great, but Peach and Bowser did not get completely shafted this time around. Yes, they're once again in their expected roles, but they actually have dialogue and a presence in the story this time around. Peach is the one who initiates Mario's journey as she brings him the colorless toad in the opening, and until Black Bowser kidnaps her, she actually has a ton of dialogue and interaction with other characters. And even after she's taken away, she provides information to Mario and Huey on their quest like the first two games, only without any segments where you play as her. Then there's Bowser, who still has a reduced presence in this game compared to Paper Mario, and especially TTYD, but at least actually has dialogue this time, and it's good dialogue too. This was one of the most disappointing areas of the last game, and I'm glad to see that Color Splash brought it back in the right direction. As for Huey, he's alright, I guess? He's just kind of the mouthpiece for Mario, and he doesn't have a defined personality like Kirsty or the emotional storyline of Tippy. I don't hate Huey, but he never really stuck out to me in any way, even if he gets an occasional chuckle out of me from one of his snide remarks. That's the element of Color Splash's story that really stands out: the tone. This game is full of sarcastic jabs that indicate how the storytellers aren't taking the plot of this adventure that seriously, as well they shouldn't. The Shy Guys are sucking up paint from everywhere, essentially stealing the life force of this world, but the inhabitants of Prisma Island just kind of seem to be living their lives, not because they're oblivious to what's happening, but because it doesn't affect them that much in the grand scheme of things. There's certainly a very chill and down-to-earth atmosphere here that hasn't been present since the first game, and if you recall, I loved that about the original Paper Mario. But whereas in that game it was more cozy and comforting, Color Splash is more about being silly first and foremost, essentially downplaying the conflict within its own dialogue and story beats. Nowhere is that more apparent than the script, which is absolutely stuffed with quirky bits of humor. Humor was a focus of the previous game too, but Color Splash is way more overt than its predecessors when it comes to how it treats its storyline. Color Splash adheres to a just throw every joke you can think of at the wall and hope that it sticks approach, rarely letting a moment go by where the game isn't trying to make you laugh. This slapshot style of comedy can work if done correctly, but it frequently leads to an inconsistent level of quality in the writing, and that's certainly true here. Most of its jokes are derived from quick wit and sharp dialogue, which can be charming, but at some point becomes incredibly annoying, as if everyone's trying to one-up each other with a snappy quip. I want to say the humor landed more often than not for me, but in many instances I merely accepted a joke instead of laughing at it, and in a number of them I was rolling my eyes. The physical comedy worked the best for me, as something in the timing and animations absolutely destroyed me and were a nice surprise. What was an absolutely terrible surprise were all the references and meme slang, because my god, if a meme or popular saying existed before Color Splash was created, chances are the game references it at some point. And look, there's nothing wrong with references when done in moderation, but this is just going way too overboard. I mean, there's a Hammer Brothers in this game who says fam. I'm just gonna let that speak for itself. I almost wanted to give Color Splash credit for being really funny, and sometimes it is, but man, they push this element too far. In a lot of places, it feels like the first draft of the script was published before anyone had time to do some quality control, and I can't speak for whether this is a localization thing or comes from the original writers, but it certainly drags Color Splash back in an area that it could have soared in. But even after that, and considering all the other problems I had, Color Splash was still a game that I enjoyed playing. Yes, the battle system isn't engaging and the writing can be a bit much, but when all was said and done, I liked it more than I disliked it. I understand this game has its detractors and haters like Sticker Star, and it's perhaps because of how similar those two games are that fuels that criticism, and maybe for good reason. But for me, the game looks amazing and has a very relaxed atmosphere to it, and that goes a long way in absorbing you into the adventure. For the only game in the series that I had no experience with at all going into it, I was pleasantly surprised with Color Splash and consider it a solid entry in the series, gameplay and writing problems notwithstanding. It is nowhere near the level of quality of the first two games, and its design flaws do prevent me from giving it a full endorsement, but if you're willing to look past those areas, there's going to be something here for you to enjoy, just like Sticker Star. We're nearly finished with the Paper Mario retrospective, as there's only one more stop on this train, the 2020 Nintendo Switch game, The Origami King. Here's to hoping this series will end on a good note. Hey, thanks so much for watching this video. If you liked it, then give it a like, leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more uploads. And remember, you can vote on my January retrospective by checking the link in the description or in the comments below. Thanks for watching!